Hi everyone, and welcome back to Alana and Jamie. We're dealing with communication with a focus on listening. And today we want to kind of open up how to work with really aggressive people, difficult people, how to create an environment where listening can take place. The fundamental principle of our approach to listening is really based in the idea of creating space for someone. To really create an environment where they can really be themselves. They can express themselves somewhat freely, and with, I guess, the hope, the goal, right, is that as the person talks and shares in a very free space, you kind of steward them into a place where they are having their own insight and their own understanding, and the conversation can kind of go down into being a little bit deeper.
Mm-hmm. Now, we're a bit nervous about this topic because when people say aggressive, dealing with aggressive people or difficult people, obviously we all really worry about our relationships with abusive people that can be toxic, and sometimes the best thing is to pull away from those relationships. Right. So just quickly to make a distinction between what we're talking about over here. First of all, I've certainly seen in life that you can have very aggressive people who are not that abusive. They're just very expressive and they're very forceful, and and then
I don't know who she means.
No, not you, you're nice. And then you can have people who are actually very abusive, and you will hardly see any aggression at all. So when we talk about the difference between aggression and abuse, we're distinguishing between whether a person is trying to control you or corner you or manipulate you, versus when they're aggressive, it could just be that they have a very forceful way of expressing themselves, but actually have a lot of respect for your boundaries, and there's a very healthy balance between you in life and your needs and them and their needs. So if anybody wants to go on a deeper dive, let us know. But I'll give you a funny example of people who are very, very aggressive, not particularly abusive. That's babies. Okay, they will scream, they will shout, they will, they won't say thank you, they won't be nice. They will let you know, they'll go completely hysterical and tantrum, but they haven't really try to hurt you or control you. It's just how they are. So I know that's like a funny example, but there is a distinction between the way that I need to express myself and whether that is actually affecting you in your life. Right. So we're talking here about people who are very animated, very difficult. There's a lot to contain when they're expressing themselves, and yet they have respect for boundaries. But how do you listen to them?
So yeah, I mean, look, to me, I think what we're trying to do is, as I said before, we're trying to create an environment where they can burn themselves out, where a person comes in and they might be swearing, and you might not like that, or they might be rude, or they might be this, that, and the other, but not focused about you. They're really in one. They're just like caught up in it, like road rage type of feeling, like, oh, they were doing this, and I can't believe it. It's a whole process. But when you can create the atmosphere around them that they can just talk it out, they're going to get to a place where they're suddenly beginning to realize, hang on, maybe I was being a bit aggressive, maybe I was being a bit rude. Often they'll apologize afterwards. I'm sorry, I know I wasn't shouting at you. I was just like so frustrated with the thing, right? And that's a sign that you've succeeded actually, in terms of just letting them burn out, letting them work it through internally and getting to a place, I guess, for their own insight.
Yeah, totally. Because again, we have different ways of processing, but as a listener, I can play a really big role in your experience. Like I remember a time when I had received some bad news and someone was trying to listen to me, and all I was doing was crying. And I remember very clearly that they wanted me to be quiet. I was making them feel very uncomfortable because I was so upset, and they kept on going shh, shh, shh. And I remember feeling, I'm not really ready to stop crying yet. But I guess if you want me to, I'll try to shush. And I was bottling my feelings in. Really, what I needed was a few more minutes of just crying it out, and then I would have transitioned. I would have transitioned from this extremely emotional place that I was in into something a little bit more calm, a little bit more reasonable. And the listener plays a really big role in that. The underlying belief is that if I succeed in listening to you well, I can really help you get to the next stage of your processing, which is post-hysteria, and now into some form of calm, and eventually the goal is to some form of insight.
Yeah, and I think another really important part of this, from the perspective of being a listener, is not just this kind of very maternal creation of space for the person, but what tends to happen actually is, I don't know if you've had this experience, but when someone's really in one and just going on and on, you kind of, it's not easy to feel respectful towards them. They're really caught up in themselves and they're being very aggressive and this, that, and the other. But if you can let them get to a place where they've kind of talked it out, and now they're starting to bring solutions to their own problems. You start to, from a relationship standpoint, understand how they process things. Oh, they go a bit mad, and then they calm down, and they start making jokes, and then in the end they're like, I guess what I should do is this, and you can actually gain respect for their insight. If you interrupted right at the beginning and started giving advice, you might feel like they really looked at it wrong. It was actually hard for them to accept the correctness of this advice that I was giving, which is so obvious in normal, in the light of day, normal light of day. It was so obvious what needed to happen over here. That's what happens if you interrupt. But if you let them flesh it out themselves, number one, you see them processing and calming down, which builds a certain sense of affection, a certain sense of respect, and then the solutions that they find will often be very deep, and you can gain a lot of respect for the person's abilities actually to understand the situation properly. Just let them process.
Because the rule always is, the wisdom that I find inside myself is going to strike me as much more relevant than any wisdom that anybody throws at me. So if, as a listener, I can facilitate someone coming to that space of their own wisdom, then I've done them a much bigger service than if I've tried to, share my wisdom with them.
Yeah, but there's one other right important point over here, which is that when they're off on one and going mad, we're not talking about abusive over here, but even within the aggression, you are really allowed to maintain your own red lines.
Yeah, totally. If there's especially in a romantic relationship where there's an agreement to, whatever happens, I do not break things, I do not swear, I do not scream, because I know that makes you feel very uncomfortable. It's okay, unless it's a very exceptional situation of anger, to retain your norms for what your relationship allows for, so that everybody can feel that they're being respected and that the conversation is productive and helpful.
Yes, I guess in a nutshell, make space for the person, allow them to flesh it out. If it's really uncomfortable the way they're expressing themselves, an example is just like too much swearing, or their voice is too loud, or you feel like they're being aggressive towards you even though you know that they're not. It's okay to remind them of that. But in general, our goal in listening is to create that space so the person can find their own insight.